What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and we've got an exciting video here because we're jumping into a new format. I've enjoyed my time in Airblade, even though the format's very degenerate, but I'm excited to get into a bit more of a competitive format, and this will be the format that we're going to have our next YGO from Zero monthly tournament in, over on the YGO from Zero Discord server, so jump in to that link in the description there if you want to play it. But, this is a very interesting format because it's one that hasn't really been explored before. It's basically a completely new format. And the reason why I've decided to make this format is because for me, I like having there be a format existing for every ban list in the game's history. Some ban lists can have more than one format to it. I mean, that's happened multiple times. Airblade and Chimera Tech both share a ban list, for instance. But I think given that, a ban list is meant to give rise to a specific competitive environment, I personally like it when there is a format for every ban list so people can experience those competitive environments. And if you look at the formats that are typically played, going from Airblade, the next format chronologically is generally viewed as Trooper format, which is a fun format that I'm excited to dive into, but it's one using the June 2007 limited list. And that's jumping from the December 2006 limited list, where they banned Stein, all the way to June 2007, and it's skipping over March 2007. So I wanted to make a format surrounded by March 2007, and so the format that I decided to do it for, both because I thought it would be kind of catchy and cool, to focus a format around a tournament that was won by a very iconic deck, I decided to base that tournament around SJC Anaheim of 2007, which took place in April 28th, 2007. So it does use the March 2007 ban list, but it also is missing some cards that are introduced into Trooper format. Trooper format introduces, when going from Airblade to that, it introduces the core set Strike of Neos, Force of the Breaker, and Tactical Evolution, along with some promos and stuff like that. But this format, which I'm calling Demise Format, because that format was actually won by a Demise OTK deck, which is a very, very cool deck that I'll get into later in this video. This format will only be using Strike of Neos plus some promos. So I'll get into the new cards added to the card pool shortly. But first, I need to discuss the March 2007 ban list itself, because that's what we're really here for, right? The reason why I'm making this format is because of this ban list. So let's talk about what this ban list does and what it does not do, what it changes from the previous ban list, and how I think that will sort of change the way the game is played compared to something like Chimera Tech format. So firstly, let's start with the banned cards. Demise, while being the namesake of the format, is not banned. I mean, I guess that makes sense. But I just have it here on the screen as sort of an illustrative thing for the name of the format. Now, the ban list itself is pretty good, in my opinion. There are some major problematic cards that are hit compared to the previous ban list. So let's dive into that. But before we dive into the new changes, we got to talk about the old cards that are still on here, namely BLS, CED, Chaos Sorcerer. All those Chaos monsters are gone. You can't really play Chaos in this format, but I think that is pretty good at this time in the game's history because Chaos is still very strong if it did come off the ban list here. Other than that, Victory Dragon is the other sort of boss monster here that's banned. Victory Dragon is not really that powerful of a card. It never really took a ton of names in the TCG, but part of the reason for that is because the way that TCG forfeit rules work is that, like, if your opponent brings out Victory Dragon and tries to attack you for game and pull off its, effect to basically win the entire match, your opponent just concede before the attack actually connects. And so you can potentially just sort of cheese your way around this win con, and Victory Dragon cause a bunch of judging headaches and things like that. So this card did indeed get banned, and I don't blame them for banning this, even though it's not really that good. Now, moving on from the boss monsters themselves into ways to get out the boss monsters, Cyberstein here is still banned. Thank goodness. This card ruined a lot of potentially great GX formats because it's just so powerful at doing crazy fusion plays. Of course, Scientist preceded it on the ban list here, and this card is really strong as well. This card actually enabled a variety of FTK decks surrounding it, and so it probably is good that this thing is gone. And speaking of these monsters that bring out fusion monsters, Thousand Eyed Restrict is also on the ban list, the only extra deck monster that is on here, although this time it was the fusion deck because only fusion monsters existed. And it makes sense why this is gone, because Go Control was a very powerful deck, and so they wanted to curb the power of it, so they got rid of this thing. And also with things like instant fusion in the game now, this card becomes a lot more powerful, so it makes sense why they'd want to restrict this. Moving on to the other cards here, we've got a couple cards that, lean into FDK strategy, just like with Scientist. You got Mercure the Destructor, which can turn on traps from your hand, turn 1, which can lead to some pretty crazy combos. There's the iconic combo of like Check the Yellow and Call the Han and stuff. There's also, of course, Exchange FDK, and Exchange of Spears also on here for that reason. But there's also stuff you can do with Empty Jar, potentially with Desert Sunlight, and you do have some jars on here as well. Related to that, you got Cyber Jar here, which is a very, very powerful tool in Empty Jar, which now that deck doesn't have. You also have Fiber Jar here, which isn't really a tool in Empty Jar, or at least not many builds that I've seen. There are some builds when this card is legal that potentially is using Soul Release to banish the graveyard and then reset the deck, but that deck didn't really seem that good. This card's mainly here, though, because it does slow down the pace of play a bit, and also it is a bit awkward to resolve sometimes. So it does make sense that they wanted to, get rid of this thing from the format. Moving on, I think the rest of the monsters are just generally good cards. Breaker the Magical Warrior is a good beater that pops stuff. Witch the Black Forest is a searcher, but it can search out a ton of powerful monsters. We got Magician of Faith here because recurring a spell, especially given some of the powerful spells in the format, is just a bit too strong. We got Tsukiyomi here. Again, it is a goat control hit. We got Sinister Serpent because free resources is very good and probably a bit too good to be in the game at this time. We got Tri-Infecting Virus because this thing is a board wipe and a half. So it makes sense that it's gone. And we got Yatagarasu because there are some combos you can do where you just draw like your opponent. And that's not the funnest way to end a game there. But moving on to these spells, there's a who's who of powerful spells here. And, some of them are actually newly on the list, so that's very nice to see. Pot of Greed, of course, has been here for a while, but Graceful Charity was actually legal for some of the previous formats, which is kind of surprising because this card is so good. But, they tried it out for a couple of formats, then they were like, no, this card probably should stay on here. So this card is now banned. Very happy to see that gone. You got Mirage Nightmare here, another card that allows you to draw cards, just a bit too broken, and has been on the list for a while at this point. For the hand rips, we got Forceful Sentry and Delinquent Duo, both banned here. And, I'm very happy to see that. Of course, there is a third hand rip that, we would probably like to see banned here, but unfortunately it is still in the format, and I'll get into that when we discuss the limited cards here. But moving on, we've got some board wipes as well. Regeki and Dark Hole are both here. Probably good to have them out of the format. We've got a Spell and Trap board wipe in the form of Heartbeat Feather Duster, which is just a bit too powerful and one-sided. We've got some other power cards from the original Power 5. We got Change of Heart and Monster Reborn, both very strong. Just getting a free spell summon from the grave and taking your opponent's monster is very, very good. For the last of the truly broken spells here, we got Painful Choice, sending 5 cards from your deck to the graveyard, even if your opponent gets to give away one in hand. I mean, it's just too good at this stage in the game. There's tons of graveyard setup you can do, and ultimately at the end of the day, you're still getting a strong card to hand. So this card is really, really good and can't really be in the format here. And then the last 2 cards are more specific, but they are still pretty good if you can get them off in the right circumstances. Butterfly Dragger Elma can do infinite loops, and Last Will, which is a new inclusion to the list here. This card is really good in a variety of strategies for a variety of different purposes. It's a very versatile card, a very confusing card, but its confusingness is part of what makes it so broken. And so I'm not sad to see it on the list here. This card is also very, very good and probably should not be illegal at this point in the game. For the traps, there aren't that many, but the ones that are here are very strong or very confusing, or both. We got Imperial Order. This shuts down all spells. This card is absurdly broken, ruins a lot of DM formats. Not maybe ruins them, but it's definitely the worst part of a lot of DM era formats, so I'm glad to see this one gone. Shade the Spirit here, as I mentioned, for FTK shenanigans, and last turn here, just because it is a crazy alt win con that is not really that fun to play against. I mean, some people would, say, oh, it's really fun to play, but this thing is also gone. Lots of these forbidden cards is Time Seal here. This is, not really the most egregious trap in the world, but you can do different, loops with it, with Mask of Darkness, getting it back, and just draw locking your opponent, just like with Yatagarasu, so it's probably a good thing that it's gone here, and so that is banned as well. Now let's move on to the limited cards and see what powerful cards we can actually play around with decks in the format. Now, the limited list is a bit bigger than the forbidden list section of the video, but, don't worry, you don't need to know all these cards here to play decks. There are some staples, but a lot of it is somewhat specific, and can't get much more specific than Exodia. Awesome win con, one of the most iconic strategies in the game's history, but these are largely here for flavor reasons, because you should only have one of each piece because they are so powerful, right? So this thing, if they increase this to 2 or 3 copies, I'm not sure if it would really do much at this stage in the game, but it's still cool to have on the limited list either way. Moving on to the other monsters here, we got some big bosses in the form of Dark Magician of Chaos and Jinzo here. Jinzo shuts down all traps, and Dark Magician of Chaos can do a variety of things, getting back a spell from grave in Reasoning Gate decks, also just banishing your opponent's stuff, which can be very good as well. This card is also limited. Moving on to the weaker monsters here, we got Treeborn Frog, which can enable these big guys to come out, and very, very strong card, and things like Monarchs, which are still a good deck in this format. So, this is a very powerful card to be limited here. We got Twin-Headed Behemoth, which can serve a similar role to Treeborn Frog, but Twin-Headed Behemoth is largely here just because there was a weird ruling confusion around it at the time, where like if it got shuffled back in the deck, how would you tell which copy had used its effect or not? So they eventually resolved this, but it was on the limited list for some time before they actually did that on the card text. Now moving on to a way that you can actually deal with these monsters here, either the big ones or the small ones. We got DD Warrior Lady, very, very strong card, just banishing stuff. That is pretty good here in this format. If you want to deal with things in a different way, though, we've also got Neospatian Grandma, which is actually a new card that I'll be getting to when I discuss the Strike of Neos pack here. And this card is very, very good. It bounces back your opponent's stuff, which can be very powerful. And so this card is definitely one to keep an eye on. But we'll talk about that more when we discuss the new cards. Moving on to another anime card that actually made it on the list, we've got Elemental Hero Stratos, the terror of Airblade format. This thing was limited. I think very good choice there because this thing was just a little bit too broken at 3, but still a very good card. Search it out a hero and could potentially do some spell and trap popping shenanigans there. We've got Sangan here, which can search out a variety of things as well. This card is very good. Makes sense why it's at 1 though, because the thing that you search out with Sangan are generally weaker than the things you'd search out with Witch. Next up, we got Spirit Reaper, can be a wall, can get in to rip cards out of hand. So either way, very, very good card here. We've also got Morphing Jar. If you want to rip things out of your opponent's hand, you do give them 5 more cards though, but you're also drawing 5 more. So this is a pretty good card, all things considered. If you're playing a deck using Morphing Jar, maybe like an Empty Jar style deck, then Night Assailant's another card that you probably want to know about. This is a flip monster that does destroy a monster your opponent controls, and that's still pretty good. But the main reason why you play this is because it gets back monsters from graveyard, which is also extremely good here for just setting up your plays and sort of forming some resource loops. Now, with only one Night Assailant legal, you don't really need to worry about those loops as much, but it is still good that it's on the list here, because if you had more than one Night Assailant available, then, things could get pretty crazy pretty quickly. Next up, we got Protector of the Sanctuary. This thing here is not really that good of a card. It does prevent your opponent from drawing due to like card effects. So you can do some kind of wonky stuff with it. Like if you activate a card destruction here, and then you chain call the Haunted to bring back the Protector of the Sanctuary, then your opponent won't draw any cards off the card destruction, so it's kind of a hand rip. But that's a pretty convoluted combo, so I don't really think this card is that good, but it is on the list because, the power of that potential combo is still very scary. Moving on to these spells, we got the last hand rip that I mentioned in the forbidden section of the video. We get Confiscation. I mean, this thing, why is it still in the game? Just get it out of here. I don't know why they felt the need to keep this around. Very good card, and I'm hoping it gets banned in the next format. But next, we got Snatch Steal, taking control of the opponent's monster. Very, very good. We've also got some spell and trap removal, and this is where we get into the slightly more fair cards, in my opinion. Like Snatch and Comfy are both broken, but True Nade Heavy and MST, I think, are a bit less so. I mean, I still think they should be limited to 1, don't get me wrong, but they've just got fairer effects. I mean, Giant True Nade is generally used in unfair decks, like OTK decks and things like that. But ultimately, I don't think it's that bad. But so I'm happy with these limits here. Next up, we've got, some of the Stolly cards that you'd use these spawn trap removals on. We got Level Limit Area B and Sword of Revealing Light. These both wall off attacks used in stall decks. So in my opinion, it's good that they're limiting this to 1, as stall decks are a very polarizing strategy, and a lot of people don't like playing against them. Of course, they can also be used against equip spells, and there are a variety of good ones in this format. Premature Burial, bring back your monster, is very good, and especially with True Nade, which can bounce it back and keep the monster around, that's a very, very good combo. So this card is very strong, even though it can only pull from your graveyard, and it can be disrupted. We've also got Mage Power and United We Stand, which are largely here for like OTK decks, which could potentially do things with them. I don't really think they necessarily need to be on this list, but I understand why they are here, especially with Scapegoat in the format. You could potentially United We Stand and Scapegoat to get a big monster there. And, I'm not really sure Scapegoat had to be limited either, because, this was mainly a goat control hit. But this can be a bit of a stallier card, just like these other ones here. So I think it is probably best that it is limited here. And the last of the cards that you'd really use your spell and trap removal against is something like Future Fusion. Future Fusion is a very strong card at setting up things like a Dragon OTK turn. You've got like, machine OTK turns as well with Chimera Tech, largely using like Overload Fusion after you've dumped a bunch of machines to grave, and then bringing them back with like Dimension Fusion, and potentially even buffing them up with limiter removal. And it should show the power of that combo, or at least the scary nature of that combo, that all those combo pieces are now limited. You've only got 1 limiter, you've only got 1 dim fuse, you've only got 1 Overload Fusion, you've only got 1 Future Fusion. So I think that is ultimately a good thing. As while that combo isn't like the worst thing in the world in terms of like, being overpowering, I do think that it is still very good, and it can be a bit unfun to lose to. Next up, we've got card destruction here. This card can also be a bit unfun if you're playing against this, playing it. This card can be very strong for your opponent, like cycling through their stuff, but it also can be, pretty disappointing for you losing your hand. So it makes sense why this thing is limited here. And also, you probably don't want this around for like degenerate empty jar strategies as well. But next up, we got Chain Strike. This was the corner piece of a new deck, Chain Burn. But, they're limiting it down to 1 because I guess people don't really like when burn decks can thrive. So Chain Strike is unfortunately a casualty of that. But you can still make a Chain Strike deck list in this format. It's just not really going to be as good with only 1 Chain Strike around. Next up, we got Book of Moon, which is a very versatile card, one of the best cards in this format, just able to set down either your monsters or your opponent's monsters. Very, very flexible effect. And of course, you can potentially even pair it with a Nobleman of Crossout, which is a great way to deal with set monsters because it banishes them, deals with flip effect monsters, get them out of the deck as well. It's a very strong card here. Lastly, we got Pot of Avarice, which not every deck can use, or not every deck should use. It sends 5 monsters from your graveyard to your deck, and then you draw 2. So very powerful effect to draw 2 and also replenish your deck a bit. But if you're not going through a ton of monsters, then this card is not necessarily the best for you. But I still think it is a very, very good card overall. Moving on to the traps, we got a new one to start out with. We got Crush Card Virus. This card is broken. I'm going to discuss this when I talk about the new promo cards that came out in this format. But this was a prize card at the time, and it is an absurdly busted prize card. Now, in Dueling Book, they have the errata text here, which is a bit less good than its original effect. But when we play these old formats, we generally play with the original effects. So you would be using the original effect, which is just you tribute 1 dark monster with 1,000 less attack, and then you get to look at their hand and field, and you destroy all the monsters with 1,500 or more attack among them. And then for the next 3 cards, or the next 3 turns, that is, every card they draw, you check them, and if it's a monster for 1,500 or more attack, it's destroyed as well. So absolutely busted card, not that hard to pull off. I mean, even on this limit list, you see like Sangan and Spirit Reaper here are both monsters that do satisfy its condition. And so this thing is just absolutely busted and not a really fun card to play around with. So kind of unfortunate that it's in the format now, but it is something to consider if you are building a deck. You have to either be able to play Crush Card or play around Crush Card, and that is no tall order, especially when Mind Crush is in the format as well. Because if your opponent knows all the things that you're drawing off of Crush Card, then they can potentially easily Mind Crush the best card out of your hand as well. So it makes sense why they limited this thing as well. Moving on to the more generic traps, I think are a little bit more fair. We got Ring of Destruction, Mirror Force, Torrential Tribute. I mean, these are all ways to stop your opponent's monsters, and they all do slightly different things. Ring deals some burn damage. Mirror Force pops their entire attack position monsters, and Torrential Tribute pops the entire field when a monster is summoned. But I think they're all, very fun in their own way, and they are good to know about in the form because you will have to play around these sometimes. Next up, we got Call the Haunted, which can bring back a monster from your graveyard. Very, very good stuff. Just like Premature Burial, although you can't really use it as actively as Premature Burial because, you draw it, you have to set it and wait a turn. Still a very, very good card because you can use it reactively. So I like this card a lot. We got Magic Cylinder next, another hit to a burn strategy. This also is somewhat of a stally card because it doesn't negate an attack. But I think it's generally like not as, annoying to play against as things like, Level Limit or Swords. So very good card in the right context. We got a Ceasefire here as well for another burn card. Also flips up flip effects, so against flip effect strategies, this can be good to bring in. But this thing is, pretty decent all around and sees some play in a variety of side decks, as well as just burn decks proper. Next up, we got Gravity Bind, another stally card here. So they're really trying to hit burn and stall, which I think is good for the health of the format overall. Although when you see some of the decks that are legal in this format, it might not be the healthiest format to begin with. And lastly, we got Ultimate Offering. This card is very good in certain decks, like Gadgets, for instance. It's very good there. So it makes sense why this thing is limited to 1 copy. And that's going to do it for the limited list. Let's dive into these semi-limits before we dive into the new cards added to the card pool. Now, many people don't really view the semi-limited list as that important or effective, and I don't really either. I don't think it really impacts the game that much, except for very specific cards, and not really many of these on this list here I really count in that category. Apprentice Magician is one that potentially could, unless you get out spellcasters from the deck. So that could either be more Apprentice Magicians or things like Old Magician. Can't do Magician of Faith anymore because that's banned. And because Magician of Faith is banned, this card's a lot less good, but it's still something you can play, especially in an Apprentice Monarch build. We've also got Double DD Sailing here. This was limited. Now back to 2 copies. I think that makes sense as it is a bit specific, and it's still very good. It's a beater that can banish your opponent's stuff, but I do think that it's not as good as something like DD Warrior Lady, for instance. Next up, we got Mana Core of Darkness. This has been here for a while because you can do strange loops with it, so it's good to have this thing semi-limited, so it's not too consistent. Next, we got Mask of Darkness. I think they were afraid of doing like loops with this thing, but now the time seal's banned. Now that like Sook's gone as well, you really don't think this needs to be on the limited list. So this thing is not really, worth limiting or semi-limiting in any way. So I think it's probably not going to last on the semi-limited list that much longer. Next up, we got Creature Swap. This can be decent in certain recruiter decks, giving your opponent recruiter and taking their monster, attacking over, etc. But it's not really the best thing in the world. There are better things that decks can be doing. So I don't really think this thing needs to be limited. Semi-limited is probably fine. Metamorphosis is now semi-limited as well. This thing was limited, but without things like, Thousand Eye Restrict, it's a bit less good. So it's still strong. You can like meta away a Cyber Dragon into like Dark Balder or something like that. But I think overall this card is not as good as it used to be. Next up, we got Rhoda at 2 copies. It's been at 2 for quite some time. It's kind of just a consistent hit to Warriors, but that deck is pretty consistent anyways, so it doesn't really make much of a difference. But either way here, if you want to build a Warrior deck or a deck playing Warriors, you only get 2 Rhodas. Next up for the traps, we got a Deck Devastation Virus. The thing is still strong, but it's not anywhere as busted as Crush Card Virus. This thing has a bit of a stricter, cost to actually pull off. It also hits things with 1500 or less attack, which generally isn't as bad for players as 1500 or more attack. So, this thing, semi-limited, is still good, but not as busted as Crush Card. Next up, we got Good Goblin Housekeeping. This is a card that depends on other copies of Good Goblin Housekeeping to be in rotation, so semi-limiting this makes sense. Next up, we got Reckless Greed. Any deck that wants to play 3 Reckless Greed is probably not the healthiest deck to have in format, so it makes sense why the thing's semi-limited. And last, we got Wall of Reeling Light, another stall card, but a stall card with a much deeper cost than things like Gravity Bind and Level Limit Area B. So it makes sense why this thing is semi-limited. And then, before we move on to the new cards, I want to talk about the cards that came off the list entirely. So we had a bunch of semi-limited cards that, are now no longer semi-limited. We also had some limited ones that are now no longer even on the list at all. So Exiled Force and Upstart Goblin were the 2 semi-limited cards here. I don't really think having 2 or 3 of these was going to make or break a certain deck. So I think it makes sense why these things are off now. And Injection Fairy Lily and Nephthys were both limited, but now they are both free. Nephthys, probably because it's actually a decent counter to Crush Card Virus. If they Crush Card your Nephthys, even if it's in hand, then that will trigger its effect on the following turn. So that's kind of a neat thing. So this is kind of a counterbalance to that. And Injection Fairy Lily is a card that gets under Crush Card Virus, so it also is probably good to have around back in the format again. But that's going to do it for the updated list here. Now let's dive into the new cards and see what this format has to offer in terms of deck building capabilities. Now, before we dive into where the big influx of new cards came from Strike of Neos, which is one of my favorite sets of all time, we've got some other assorted promo cards to discuss here. Starting with Crush Card Virus, I mentioned it in the Banlist section, so I'm not going to spend too much more time here, but this thing is really good. I mean, it is kind of format warping, and so it's something that you have to be aware of, and something that will probably ruin some of your games, but I haven't played any games in this format yet. No one really has. So we'll have to see exactly how toxic this is in this format. Speaking of things that could be potentially toxic, we've also got Destiny Hero Disc Commander. This thing is very, very good and it has a different effect from the one that's on DB. So that's how you know it's really good. So this card's effect says cannot be spell summoned from the graveyard. The turn is was sent to the graveyard. If this card spell summoned from the graveyard, you draw 2 cards. You can only use the effect of Destiny Hero Disc Commander once per duel. Now that is a bit of a butchering of the original effect, which is quite different. Now, see these conditions here, cannot be spelled from the graveyard, blah, 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 and also you can only use this one per duel. Those things were not in the original form of the card. The original form of the card just said, if this card spells from the graveyard, draw 2 cards. So, I mean, this thing is very, very good if you can get to looping it, and it can be used very, very quickly. It's also a Destiny hero, so you can pitch it off Destiny draw. So this thing is very, very good in specific decks that can actually support it. Also, it's a card you can tribute for Crush Card, so even better there. So, the combination of these cards in the format may be very, very good, for certain decks, but we'll have to see exactly how format warping they are. Now, for some other interesting cards, there's Spell Striker. I like this card a lot. It's a monster you can spell summon from your hand by banishing 1 spell from your graveyard and can attack directly, and then you take no battle damage from attacks involving it. So it's just a neat card all around. It can be used in Monarch decks as another form of extension, tribute fodder, etc. So I like this card a lot. We got Exploder Dragon as well. This can be used in Dragon decks. or just a deck that wants something to pop your opponent's stuff, because when this card is destroyed with battle instead of the graveyard, you get to destroy the monster that destroyed it, and neither player takes any battle damage from attacks involving this card. So it's kind of like Spell Striker in that regard. Next up, we move on to the cards that are a bit less good. We've got Infernal Dragon first and foremost. The level 4 dragon, 2000 attack, 0 defense. Says once per turn during the end phase of this card, attack this turn, destroy this card. When this card on the field is destroyed instead of the graveyard, you contribute 1 monster spell to summon this card from the graveyard. So there are some like neat things you can do with it. As a note, like the second part of the effect doesn't necessarily have to be triggered by its own effect, so it can survive things like Sacrifice to Armor, things like that. So that can make kind of a sticky card, but by tributing your own cards, like it can be a bit awkward. And also doesn't get over like a Cyber Dragon. So I'm not really sure how good this is, but it is a very interesting card to say the least. Next, we got Ruthless Denial. Is a spell card that says select 1 monster you control and send it to the graveyard, and send 1 random card in your opponent's hand to the graveyard. So it's like, it's fine, I guess. Like, you can do a pseudo hand rip there, and maybe the card you're sending is not really that good. But like overall, I don't really think it's worth playing. Next up, we got Damage Polarizer. This is a counter trap that says activate only when an effect that inflicts damage is activated. Negates activation effect, and each player draws 1 card. So it's kind of similar to things like Barrel Behind the Door and Trap of Border Racer, where it negates damage and then does an additional thing. But I think that this thing that does is probably the worst of the things that it does, because it gives your opponent an extra card, and in a burn deck, they kind of want every card that they can get. So I don't really think this card is that good. Next up, we got Fusion Guardian, another counter trap. It says activate only when an effect that inflicts damage is activated. Negates activation effect and randomly send 1 fusion monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. So this is a bit awkward because a lot of the cards in the format that say like send a random fusion monster to your graveyard, we've sort of like banned in tournament play online, at least, because Dueling Book doesn't really have a way to have an unlimited fusion deck in the formats like these, which don't have their own specific rooms like GOAT. And so it does make randomly sending 1 fusion monster out of an unknown selection of fusion monsters, because you could potentially be playing more, kind of awkward to implement in a tournament setting. So this is going to probably join the list along with like Memory Crusher and success probability 0% of just awkward cards that you shouldn't be playing anyways, but it's just going to be banned from tournament play. So that is a good thing to note with this card, even though it seems like it's in this format. You can't play with it, unfortunately. I don't really think that affects many decks. Like, you don't have fusion monsters that really plus you upon being sent to graveyard like you will in later formats. But, I could potentially see someone being upset about that because, like, maybe it's another monster for Overload Fusion or something. But I don't really think this card would see any play anyways if it wasn't banned. And so I'm just going to, ban it for the sake of tournament play and, competitive rated play if that exists at any point in the future. Next up, we got Return Soul. This is a normal trap that says activate only during the end phase. You return up to 3 monsters destroyed this turn from the graveyard to the owner's decks. So, I mean, there are things that you can potentially do with it. Like if your opponent activates Call of the Haunted in the end phase to bring back a monster that they, had destroyed earlier that turn, then you can chain Return Soul and send that back. But that's a very, very selective situation. And generally, you don't want to really be doing this. So this card is really, really bad. I can't really think of a good application for it in this format. Maybe to refill gadget decks, but I don't know. Do you really care about that? You're getting gadgets every turn anyways. So I don't think this card is that good. But now that we've covered some of these promo cards, let's dive into the big star of the show of this video, Strike of Neos itself. Strike of Neos is one of my favorite sets of all time. I love this thing. I opened it up as a kid, and unlike a lot of the other GX packs that have been released up to that point, I saw a pack filler that actually seemed to have a coherent strategy. And I saw support for a previous pack filler that actually made it somewhat decent. And so because of that, it really opened my mind to what a pack could be, both in terms of the archetypes in that pack and also what support could be for previous archetypes. So I like this set a lot. I think it's really, really cool. And I'm excited to give you all a guided tour of it because it is a set that's very, very near and dear to my heart. Even if you look at it and a lot of it doesn't really seem as meta breaking as you might expect. Of course, there are some very good cards in here. Neospace and Grand Mole is probably the best of the set. And this thing was immediately limited to 1. So that should tell you how good this thing can be. This is a Rock 900 attack, 300 defense point monster that at the start of the damage step, if this card battles an opponent's monster, you can return both the opponent's monster and this card to the hand. So that may not seem that good, but if you're up against a Monarch, for instance, you can summon this out, bounce it back to hand, and they might not be able to tribute summon it the next turn. You can just deal with pesky monsters like fusion monsters. You can get rid of those, get rid of ritual monsters, which can come up, as you'll see later on in the video. There's a lot of interesting things that it can, bounce back. And also, on top of that, if you already have a monster on your field and your opponent like sets a monster in defense to sort of get around that, you can bring out that Neospatian Grandmal, just keep bouncing back that monster to hand and just keep chipping in with your other monsters. So this card is really, really good. I like it a lot. It is a card that's, very good, but not too broken, which I think is important in designing cards like this. But of course, it's not the only Neospatian that came out in this set because, despite how good this card is, it is tethered to one of the worst archetypes, which is Neospatians. And I'm not saying worst archetypes because it's not fun to tinker with, but I'm just saying it because it's, like, objectively not really the best. The other Neospatians are a lot less good than Granmole. Neospatian Air Hummingbird is a wing beast, 800 attack, 600 defense. That's 1 per turn. You can gain 500 life points for each card in your opponent's hand. And Neospatian Glowmoss is kind of interesting. It has the reverse stats of Granmole exactly. That's kind of neat. It's also a plant, and it says if this card attacks or is attacked, your opponent draws 1 card and shows it. Then, based on its type, apply this effect. Monster in the battle phase of this turn. Spell, if this card is attacking, you can change it to a direct attack instead. And trap, change this card to defense position. So kind of neat, but I think that overall it's not really that good. I mean, the best thing that comes of this is that, like, you change this to a direct attack, or you like wall off your monsters. Or not your monster, but your opponent's monster from attacking in because it ends the battle phase. But your opponent's still drawing a card no matter what happens. And let's say, you're using this to defend yourself and they draw a spell, which a lot of decks are playing a lot of spells because spells are very good. Then it still gets over your Glowmoss and you've given your opponent +1. So I don't really think this is that good. Even though it is kind of neat that it has these 3 effects, it's not really that good. Also, I want to note, because Neospatian Glowmoss and Granmole's stats are reversed, I realized that Air Hummingbird is also the reverse stats of Aqua Dolphin. So I wonder if that was it must have been a conscious decision on the part of the designers to make it that way, but just kind of an interesting trend that I never noticed in Neospatian before this point. Of course, the new Neospatians got new Neos Fusions to go with them that can all be contact to just like the previous ones. So we got Elemental Hero Air Hummingbird as the cover card for the set, and a card that is notoriously rare. Was not really reprinted after this for mysterious reasons, and so there's a lot of conspiracy surrounding this card, but the card itself is not really that good. It's got 2500 attack, 2000 defense. It's a win. It can only be special summoned for your extra deck by returning the above cards you control of the deck, i.e. Neos and Neospatian Air Hummingbird, just like the other Neos fusions here. And it says while your life points are lower than your opponent's, this card gains attack equal to the difference. This card returns the extra deck during the end phase. So all Neospatians have that contact fusing condition and also returning the extra deck during the end phase condition. But the thing that goes along with it that makes it special among the other Neos fusions generally relates to the monster you fuse it with. But this actually kind of has anti-synergy with Hummingbird's effect, because Hummingbird allows you to gain life points. So realistically, you'll be above your opponent in terms of life points, probably. And Air Neos wants you to be lower than your opponent in terms of life points. So it doesn't really quite make sense here. I don't know. I don't know why it does that, but that's just how they designed it. Maybe it was a typo, or, I don't know. It's a weird sort of effect there. Next up, we got Elemental Hero Glow Neos. I'm not going to read the contact fusion or the return extra deck at the end of the turn condition because that's still there as well. The special thing about this is that once per turn during your main phase 1, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, or actually face-up card, so it doesn't even have to be a monster, and destroy that target. And if you do, apply this effect based on its type. Monster this card can attack this turn, or cannot attack this turn, that is. Spell this card can attack directly this turn, and trap change this card to defense position. I mean, I get that they're riffing off of Glowmoss's effect, but like, this is generally pretty bad unless you pop a spell, right? And for the spell thing, like, that can be pretty good because most of the time a deck will have a face-up spell if it's like a Sword of Revealing Light or a level limit area B or something like that. So you can actually attack directly. But the downside of that is if it's level limit area B, you can't attack directly because it's in defense mode, so you can't really do anything about that, especially because this goes back to the extra deck the turn special summon, so you can't change battle position that turn. So realistically, you're only using that effect if it's like swords. Future Fusion, another big continuous spell that's in this format, so you can potentially pop that and attack directly. But I mean, it's just kind of like not really the best in the world. Very, very situational. And the monster thing is fine. You pop a monster, but like, you're not doing anything with that. And you've already gone like pretty minus by shuffling the Glowmoss and the Neos back into your deck, so that's not really that good. And the trap thing, like, that's basically the monster thing, because after it's put to defense, unless you've got like 0 gravity or something, you can't then attack with it later. So I don't really think this is that good, even though, again, just like Glowmoss, it's very, very interesting there. And lastly, we've got Neos, or Elemental Hero Grand Neos. So this has the effect once per turn, you can target one monster your opponent controls, return that target to the hand. And, it's sort of like simulating Neos, or not Neos, but Granmole in that way. So that's kind of neat. And it's easily the best effect of these fusion monsters here. But like, if you get Neos, you might as well just use Neos to do that anyways. I mean, there are situations where you go for a big push at the end of the game with 2,500 attack and you want to bounce that monster back beforehand. But I think overall, Neos is just the better card. Or not Neos, but Neospatian Granmole is just the better card. So I don't really think it's worth going into the Granmole fusion here. But that's going to do it for the new Neospatian cards. You also had some non-monsters to support the archetype as well. Firstly, being Neoforce, the quick spell that says equip only to Elemental Hero Neos, gain data on attack when it destroys a monster by battle and send it to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the original attack of the destroyed monster in the graveyard. During the end phase, shuffle this card into the deck. So it's kind of neat that it's got the same like condition of the fusion monster where it's shuffled back into the deck at the end of the turn. But I mean, I don't know. It just seems not really that good. I mean, it's mainly just a burn card, honestly. Either you're burning for the direct attack with Neos for 800, or you're burning just to deal that a bit of damage based on the original attack of the destroyed monster in the graveyard. Neos doesn't really need the attack boost. There are some niche cases where it can come up. For instance, against Dark Condition of Chaos, or if your opponent has like a Chimera Tech Dragon that has 3,200 attack. But like, I think overall, Neos Force is not really that good. There are other cards that can basically do what it does a bit better. And yeah, it's just not really that good of a card because Neos Stick don't really want to be burning. It just kind of wants to be, attacking them with Neos. And generally, you don't need this to do that. But Heroes did get another piece of support that is actually really good. And it's the centerpiece of a deck that was somewhat popular in this time period. And that is Skyscraper 2 Hero City. This is a field spell that says 1 per turn. During your main phase, if you control this card, you can target 1 elemental hero monster in your graveyard that was destroyed by battle and special summon that target. That may not seem that interesting here, and to be fair, it only really becomes interesting later on in the game's history. But, it is kind of cool that it's here. You can do things with like bring back Stratos to get multiple effects off Stratos, which is kind of neat with it. So I like this card a lot. I think it's kind of cool. And a note, the destroyed by battle thing is just over the course of the game. It doesn't necessarily have to be when this card was on field or this turn or things like that. So it does give this card a bit of an interesting application there in hero deck. So I'm definitely going to be experimenting with this in this format. The other hero card that was released here is Change of Hero Reflector Ray. This is a very interesting normal trap. It says when an elemental hero fusion monster you control is destroyed by battle, send it to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to its original level times 300. So again, another burn card for heroes. I'm not really sure if they need it or not, but they got it. So that's kind of neat here. Add a note, I'm sure people are saying, oh, what about Hero Metal? That's a hero card as well. Well, no, it's not quite a hero card because it has capital H, but no other capitals in the title there. Although, all the text on Yu-Gi-Oh cards kind of look like titles, but you know what I mean. It doesn't have the big letters of hero. This is not technically a hero card. I will be talking about it later, though. Actually, I'll just talk about it now. It's just not really that good of a trap. It just says when this set card is destroyed and sent to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, shuffle it into the owner's deck, and then draw 1 card. So it's kind of like a cycler, but it's a really bad cycler. You just better off using Jar of Greed or Legacy of Yatagarasu. Actually, I'm not sure Legacy's out yet, but you're better off using Jar of Greed here. So, this card really should never see play. Next up, though, we got actually good support for elemental heroes, especially with Neos decks. Because we got Ancient Rules, the normal spell to special summon 1 level 5 or higher normal monster from your hand. So you can potentially use this in a Neos deck, especially if you go Stratos, search Neos, Ancient Rules out the Neos. That can be pretty neat. And it's not specific to Neos because it's just normal monster adjacent support in general. But I do think the Neos decks would appreciate this card in general. Of course, there were a lot of normal support cards in this set. And that's one of the interesting themes of this set is normal monsters, because there's both the normal monsters themselves that are very interesting, and also cards surrounding normal monsters that are also pretty interesting. So, firstly, I want to talk about Birthright. There's a continuous trap that says activate this card by targeting 1 normal monster in your graveyard, special summon that target in attack position, and then when this card leaves the field, destroy that monster. When that monster leaves the field, destroy this card. So this is basically Call of the Haunted, but for normal monsters. And that can be very good because a lot of the time, normal monsters are very strong stat-wise. I mean, Neos is strong stat-wise, but a lot of the other normal monsters that you could potentially play in this deck are also pretty strong stat-wise. So this is a pretty good card overall if you want to go in on the normal strategy. And there are some other cards that you can potentially pair that normal strategy with. For instance, Advanced Ritual Art actually opens the doors to a lot of cool ritual strategies related to normal monsters, because it is a ritual spell. says this card used to ritual summon any one ritual monster. You must also send normal monsters from your deck to the graveyard whose total level equal the level of the ritual monster. So, it does have some downsides compared to a typical ritual spell because it does have to equal exactly the level of the monster. But if you build your deck in the correct way, you can potentially pull this off pretty easily. And of course, we'll be getting into a deck that does that very effectively later in the video. But I do want to highlight that initially, I think this was mainly meant for the ritual monsters in this set. Because there are a variety of ritual monsters in this set that actually do, benefit with normal monsters being in the grave. The first of them being Cuchulainn the Awakened. I probably butchered that pronunciation. I apologize to any Celtic viewers out there. But this card's pretty cool. It's a ritual monster level 4, 500 attack, 1000 defense. It says this card can only be ritual summoned with the ritual spell card Emblem of the Awakening. So actually, you can't use this with advanced ritual art. That's kind of weird that they say, yeah, that's kind of weird. That's kind of an anti-synergy. But either way, there's a card that uses normal monsters there. Because once per turn, you can remove from play one normal monster from your graveyard. This card gains attack equal to that normal monster's attack until the standby phase of your next turn. So the idea is, if you've ritual arted away some monsters here, then you can potentially use them to buff up the Cuchulainn and get in for some big damage. As for the emblem you bring this out with, it's just kind of a standard ritual spell. It's just used to ritual summon Cuchulainn, and you have to treat monsters whose total levels equal 4 or more from your field or hand. So it's not really the best compared to like advanced ritual art, but it is a way to get out Cuchulainn. And if you want a level 4 normal monster to do it with, you've got Genemorph Warwolf. This is the first normal monster that's a level 4 with 2000 attack. So power creeping Gemini Elf. And this card is very strong for that. I mean, 2000 attacks, nothing to scoff at, even if you got Cyber Dragons running around getting over this thing. I mean, you buff up Cuchulainn to 2500 attack with it, so that's kind of neat as well. The other ritual monster in this set that benefits off normal monsters is Lycanthrope. This is level 6, 2400 attack, Beast Warrior ritual, and it can only be ritual summoned with the ritual spell card Synthesis Spell. So just like Cuchulainn, they've got this prime synergy here, they're just not using it. So very unfortunate there. But when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, inflict 200 damage to your opponent for each normal monster in your graveyard. So this does a bit of burn based on the normal monster in your graveyard. So kind of neat effect. But again, it's very disappointing, just like with Cuchulainn, that you can't bring it out with advanced ritual art. But we've also got the spell here, and it's used for ritual summon Lycanthrope. I mean, it's just a standard ritual spell. You tribute monsters level equal to 6 or more from your field or hand. So if you're looking for level 6 normal monster to do this with, you've got Frosted Source with the level 6, 2600 attack monster. And just like with Genemorph Warwolf, power creeping Gemini Elf, I'm pretty sure this power creep Summon Skull, as a 1 tree 2600 is, I think, the highest stat on a 2600 or on a level 6 monster there up to this point in time. We've also got Spiral Serpent. This is a level 8 normal monster that's 2900 attack, 2900 defense. So it's just a big stat monster, but at that point you might as well play Blue Eyes, even if this has slightly higher defense than the Blue Eyes. Moving on, we've also got cards to counter ritual cards, namely Ritual Sealing. This is a normal trap that says destroy one face-up ritual monster on the field. So it's not quite a hard counter, but it can stop ritual monsters like Cuchulainn, like Lycanthrope. But unfortunately, a lot like, the card that you'll be seeing a lot later in this video that give this format its name. I mean, you can use it, but priority exists in this format, so you can just bring out that monster and use the effect right away and sort of nullify what this does. But this card is good if you want to counter that sort of thing, and there actually are a variety of cards in this set that are meant to counter specific strategies. Just like Ritual Sealing, we got Anti-Fusion Device, which basically does what Ritual Sealing does for fusion monsters, destroying a face-up fusion monster on the field. We got Fusion Devourer here, which is a level 4 monster, 1400 attack, 1200 defense, and it says when this card battles a fusion monster, the attack of the fusion monster becomes 0 during the damage step only. I think the big flaw with a lot of these cards is that they're a bit too specific for a strategy that is already not that good. I mean, fusions aren't really the best. I mean, you can fusion out something, and that could give Fusion Devourer or Anti-Fusion Device a niche. But I don't really think it's worth playing these. Maybe in the side deck, but that would only really be in a specific metagame for it. But the other counter traps in this set are pretty good, or just counter cards in general. Well, the first of them is actually a counter trap, which is why I said that. We got Pulling the Rug. This is a counter trap that says when a monster effect is activated, that activates when a monster is normal summon. Negate the activation if you do destroy that monster. So this is really good at stopping things like Monarchs. This is really good at stopping Elemental Hero Stratos. So this card is a very good card for those cards, which are very powerful in this format. So I can definitely see this being a side deck card, or maybe even a main deck card, depending on how the format goes. So definitely good to know about. It also stops things like Manju and Senju. So that is also, something good to note for when we get to decks later in the video. But we got Transmigration Prophecy as the next card here. Very flexible traps to target 2 cards in the graveyard. Shuffle those targets into the deck. This can either be used to get back your own cards from the graveyard. It can also, more importantly, be used to stop your opponent's plays. Like if they're going for a Miracle Fusion, if they're going for an Overload Fusion, if they're going for a variety of things that can involve the graveyard, you can flip Transmigration Prophecy, shuffle some things back into the deck, and, potentially shut off that play entirely. Next up, we got Twister. This is a quick play spell that says pay 500 life points, then target 1 face-up spell trap on the field, destroy that target. And the thing is a worse Mystical Space Typhoon. Don't get me wrong. Mystical Space Typhoon's limited though, and this thing is unlimited. So if you are worried about stalled decks, this can be a good side deck card to bring in for those. Next up, we got Cloak and Dagger, the continuous trap. It says declare 1 monster card name. If your opponent normal summons, special summons, or flips that monster face up, remove that monster and this card from play. So that should tell you how old this card is, that it does not use banish, it uses remove from play instead. But this is kind of like an interesting form of prohibition for monsters. Your opponent can play around it after this is flipped up, but if their whole game plan is summoning out that monster, for instance, if they go like Rhoda or Ecall for a Stratos and you flip up Cloak and Dagger, then that can make it a little bit awkward for them. Of course, they still get the Stratos effect if they do that, so is it really the best thing in the world? I don't quite know, but it is an interesting card to, potentially, think about for side deck play. Next up, we got Eliminating the League. This is a normal trap that says discard 1 spell, then target 1 face-up monster your opponent controls, destroy that target, then look at your opponent's hand and send all cards in their hand with the same name as the destroyed card to the graveyard. So, a very, very niche card. Just like with Cloak and Dagger, probably won't see too much play because it is very niche. But I do think it is kind of an interesting card here against certain strategies. Of course, these are not really the cream of the crop when it comes to these cards that really hurt other strategies. Don't worry though, we've got one right here though, which is very, very good. DD Crow is a level 1 wing beast, 100 attack, 100 defense point monster, and it actually is a hand trap. So there are very few hand traps in this format, but DD Crow is one of them, and it's one of the best ones. I mean, it is the best hand trap in this format, I'd say. It has a quick effect that says you can discard this card to the graveyard, then target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard, banish that target. So this is kind of like Transmigration Prophecy, but much, much better. While Transmigration Prophecy can shuffle your own cards back in your deck, which can be useful, this thing, not having to set it and just being able to use whenever is really, really good. Also, as a note, it is a Crush card that you contribute for Crush card and, blow out your opponent's stuff. So this card has a lot of different uses that you can potentially, use it for, and it is a hand trap that it might not be relevant in this format. It might, but it might not be. But it'll definitely be relevant as the game goes on. Next up, we got some cards that are a bit more niche than DD Crow, but can be good in certain metagames. We got Electric Virus, which is another hand trap that says you can discard this card to the graveyard and then target 1 machine or dragon monster your opponent controls, take control of it to the end phase. We got Marionette Might, which does the same thing, but for fiend or zombies. And we've got Puppet Plant, which does the same thing, but for warrior and spellcasters. So depending on what you're expecting in the metagame, these cards can be good to bring in. You can potentially use them to go for a big damage push. You can use them to tribute for your own stuff. There's a lot of different ways that you can use these cards, and it is good to know about them for specific metagames. Now, if we're looking at warrior decks that may be potentially good in this format, I don't have the highest hopes for this deck, but it is fun that we can experiment with it, and that is 6 Samurais. Now, if you ask someone about cards from this set, the cards that they're probably going to remember the most are the 6 Samurai, because they did come out in this set, and they are a beloved archetype, for a time, right? Eventually they get to a point where a lot of people don't like them anymore, but, a lot of people do really enjoy this archetype, and I am one of them. I think it's a really, really fun deck, and I always tried to make it work as a kid, even if I didn't actually collect all the 6 Samurai to make it work. First up, we got Zanji. This is a level 4 warrior. It says, at the end of the damage step, if this card attacked, destroy the monster this card attacked. And it says you must control a face-up 6 Samurai monster with a different name to activate and to resolve this effect, which is something a lot of the 6 Samurai share. A lot of them have to have you own another 6 Samurai with a different name to actually pull off their effect here, which is very important. And then if this card would be destroyed, you can destroy another face-up 6 Samurai monster you control instead, which is also something that most of the 6 Samurais share here. Now, Zanji has 1800 attack, so it's the premier beater of the archetype, but the next beater is not too far behind it, and that is the 6 Samurai Iro, the level 4 1700 attack point monster. Says at the start of the damage step, if this card attacked a face down fish monster, destroy that monster, and then the rest of the effects are the same as Zanji. So, you have to control another 6 Samurai with a different name to use the effect, and also, if this card would be destroyed, you can destroy a different 6 Samurai monster you control instead. Next up, we've got Yaichi, which is the third best of these 6 Samurais here, the base ones at least. And this is a 1300 attack point monster, 800 defense point monster. There's 1 per turn, you can target 1 set spell or trap card, destroy that target. And then it has the whole thing with other samurais and also, you can destroy one of those instead of this. So I'm not going to repeat that after this. It's just all the 6 samurais here have it, at least in the base forms here. Next up, we've got the 6 Samurai Command, which just like Yaichi can destroy a spell or trap, but it has to be a face-up spell and trap. So Yaichi pops face downs and Command pops face ups. So that can be pretty good against specific matchups. I'm not sure if you'd want to keep this in the main deck for other matchups, but it can be good. Just to think about there. Next up, we got the attackers, and we've got 6 Samurai Nisashi here, which is a double attacker because it can attack twice each battle phase if you control another 6 Samurai. And Yuraiza is a direct attacker, so if you control another 6 Samurai, you can attack directly with this thing. I don't really think these cards are the best in their archetype. I think they're like kind of weak compared to a lot of the other better 6 Samurai effects there, both in terms of stats and effects, but they are good to know about if you are building the deck at this stage in the game. Maybe you really need an extra 6 Samurai, and so you should throw in like an Nisashi for damage potential. But it is something good to keep in mind that there are these 2 other 6 Samurais, even if they don't really see much press. Next up, we got Shien's Foot Soldier, which is a way to turbo out some 6 Samurais. This is a warrior, 700 attack, 300 defense. Says when this card is destroyed by battle instead of the graveyard, you spell summon 1 level 3 or lower 6 Samurai monster from your deck. So this can't bring out all of them, but it can bring out Yuraiza, Kaman, or Yaichi. And generally, because Yuraiza isn't really that good, you want to go for Kaman or Yaichi. But it is important to note, because this gets out another 6 Samurai, and then you can summon out another 6 Samurai and get their effects off. So that's pretty nice. Of course, another way to get their effects off is with Grandmaster of the 6 Samurai. This card is probably the best card in the archetype at this stage in the game because of what it does for that archetype. As a warrior, 2100 attack, 800 defense, says you can only control 1 Grandmaster of 6 Samurai, and if you control a 6 Samurai monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. If this card in your possession is destroyed by an opponent's card effect, target 1 6 Samurai monster in your graveyard, add that target to your hand. So this thing is really good because, as I mentioned, all these 6 Samurais need another 6 Samurai on the field to activate their effects, and Grandmaster provides that, right? You summon out a 6 Samurai, special summon out Grandmaster, and then you immediately have the other one using their effect there. Also, you can potentially destroy this to keep your 6 Samurais alive. Unfortunately, it won't get the replacement effect if that happens. But if your opponent destroys it with their effect, which they might want to do, given that it is 2100 attacker, which can be pretty good, then you do get the replacement effect, and that replacement effect can be good because it could potentially be another Grandmaster 6 Samurai. So, this card is very, very strong and is arguably the reason to play this deck at this time. Now, the other reason to play this deck at this time is Great Shogun Shien, which is another boss monster for this archetype. It is a warrior, 2500 attack, 2400 defense. So if you control 2 or more face-up 6 Samurai monsters, you can special summon this card from your hand. Your opponent can only activate 1 spell or trap card each turn. If this card would be destroyed, you can destroy a face-up 6 Samurai monster you control instead. So this thing can lock down your opponent's spells and traps, which can be very good, especially because your 6 Samurais can replace each other for destruction. So if this thing would be destroyed by the spell or trap your opponent flips up, you can pop a different 6 Samurai, and then they can't activate any more spells and traps to shut off your plays for the rest of the turn. So this thing is very, very good as a boss monster for the archetype. Having 2 6 Samurai monsters can be a bit awkward, but if you do open like a 6 Samurai plus Grandmaster plus Great Shogun, you're in a pretty good spot overall. Of course, 6 Samurai also got some support spells and traps. The first of them being Legendary Ebon Steed. This card isn't really that good. So the equip only do a 6 Samurai monster, gains 200 attack and defense. If it would be destroyed, destroy this card instead. So it's got the replacement effect for it, just like the others here. But the attack boost is not really worth using it for, and you're just better off trying to play more ways to get out 6 Samurais from your hand. Next up, we got Shien's Castle Mist, which is a field spell for the 6 Sams. It says when a 6 Samurai monster is attacked, the attacking monster loses 500 attack during damage calculation only. This card's really bad because if it's up, your opponent will never attack into your 6 Sams if they're going to lose that battle, right? So, you could argue that that's kind of what this deck wants to be doing. It wants to be the one attacking, not the one taking attacks. But I think overall, given how telegraphed it is and, how little it can do if your opponent does have good cards that can attack over your stuff, I don't really think it's worth playing here. Next up for the traps, we got Swift Samurai Storm, the continuous trap that says each turn after the first time a 6 Samurai monster control battles, all 6 Samurai monsters you control gain 300 attack until the end of this turn. So that's a neat way to boost up your 6 Samurais if you've got a bunch of them. But overall, the damage threshold that you're dealing with this is not really worth playing an extra card in your deck that can easily brick you. So I don't really think this thing is that good. The best case scenario is if you use it with a bunch of Nisashis and then get in 600 extra damage per monster. But again, I don't really think this thing is worth playing. Next up, we've got the good 6 Samurai trap, in my opinion. That's Return of the 6 Samurai. It says target 1 6 Samurai monster in your graveyard, special summon that target, destroy it during the end phase of this turn. Now, why is this good? Well, the reason why this is good is because it turns on your other 6 samurai effects. And also these 6 samurais have replacement effects for if they're going to be destroyed. So if you have a 6 samurai in hand that you don't really care about, and you have a 1 in graveyard that you really do care about, you summon the 1 from hand and then return the 6 samurai back the 1 from graveyard. And in the end of the turn, instead of popping the 1 you brought back, you can destroy a different 6 samurai instead. So I like this card for the strategy. I think it's really neat. I think it's just a good card in general, and you can potentially use this as sort of a Call the Haunted at the end of the game to like go for a ton of damage as well. But it's one of the only new archetype in the set, or I mean, actually it was kind of the only new archetype in the set, unless you count the normal stuff, but it isn't the only archetype support in this set, because there actually was a lot of support for earlier archetypes as well. And it's really cool because a lot of that support is pretty good support overall. Dark World's got a new wave of support here, starting with some new Dark World monsters, which are generally pretty good. Gren Tactician from Dark World is a level 2 Fiend, 300 attack, 500 defense. So if this card is discarded to the graveyard by a card effect, target 1 spell trap card on the field, destroy it. So this gives you a way to pop spell traps. And Cocky does the same thing, except it pops monsters. And yeah, that's pretty good in this deck, right? This deck wants to be discarding their stuff. And normally what it would do is it would just bring out a big guy. And the deck still wants to bring out big guys, don't get me wrong. But having this sort of flexibility to also pop spells, traps, and pop monsters and things like that makes it a little bit better in my opinion. Now, of course, these wouldn't really be that impactful if you don't have a way to discard them, and a good way to discard them at that. And that's where Dark World Dealings comes in. This is a normal spell that says each player draws 1 card, then each player discards 1 card. So this will trigger your Dark Worlds, draws you deeper into the deck to see other stuff. And while your opponent is drawing and discarding 1 card, so they're potentially setting up their own things, if you're discarding like a Cocky or a Gren, like you're going plus there. And even if you're special summoning out a monster, you're also probably going plus. So this thing is very, very good for the deck. I mean, this thing is basically exactly what the archetype wants in a support card. And so it's really cool to see them actually really nailing down like, okay, what is the thing that we need to give these archetypes to make them a bit better? Maybe not like the tier 1 threats that they could be, but at least like, you know, better than they were before. And Dark World Dealings is a very, very good start for that. The last of the new Dark World support is easily the worst. That's Rainbow, Overlord of Dark World. The reason why it's the worst is because it only comes back if it's discarded from your hand to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect. Now, the Dark World do have ways to trigger that, like Dark Deal and things like that. But generally what the deck is trying to do is trying to use your own cards that discard to trigger your Dark Worlds. And unfortunately, this does not fit into that game plan. But this is a monster for 2,500 attack, 1,800 defense. So if this card is discarded from your hand to the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, special summon this card from the graveyard. If summoned this way, destroy all monsters your opponent controls or all spell traps they control. So this card either becomes a Raigeki or a Harpy's Feather Duster. And that is very good if you pull it off. But again, it's very, very hard to do. And so I don't really think this thing is worth playing. The next archetype to get support is a bit less, but you know, it's still kind of neat that they're giving support for this, and that is aliens. First of them is being Alien Psychic. This is a reptile, 200 attack, 100 defense, but it's changed the defense position when it's normal summoned or flip summoned. And it says monsters with A counters cannot declare an attack. So it's a way to sort of stall out your opponent if you've got A counters on them. But if you have watched my alien video for Chimera Tech format, or just familiar with the deck a bit, then you know that aliens do have a bit of a tough time putting counters on your opponent's stuff. So this card is not really that good in my opinion, especially because one of the main ways that you get counters on your opponent's stuff is by, you know, them attacking over Alien Warrior or them potentially attacking into Alien Gray or things like that. Also, if your opponent just summons another monster that doesn't have an A counter on it, then just attacks over this and, you know, then the lock is shut off. Now, there are ways to potentially get A counter on your opponent's monster during their turn, namely A-Cell Scatterburst, that a quick play spell that says select one face-up alien monster control, destroy it, and distribute new counters equal to its level among your opponent's face-up monsters. But then you're using 2 monsters to basically set up 1 turn of the lock, which I don't really think is that good. So I don't really like this support for aliens, but it's still cool to see them giving support for aliens at least. And compared to some of the other support in the set, like, you know, I'm happy to get bad alien support if Dark World gets good support, and this next strategy gets good support as well. Because that next strategy is Counter Fairies, which is a very neat strategy that has just been underpowered up to this point. And I'm not saying it's like much better with this new wave of support, but I mean, the support actually does something cool, which I like. So firstly, we got Harvest Angel of Wisdom. Level 4 fairy, 1800 attack, 1000 defense. When this card is destroyed by balance of the graveyard, you can target 1 counter trap in your graveyard added to your hand. So you get back your most powerful counter traps that you want to use on your opponent's stuff, and that can be pretty good there. But the big monster that you're, you know, using counter traps with is Meltiel, the Sage of the Sky, because this thing I mean, along with Bountiful Artemis, this thing is probably the second best monster in the strategy. So this is a fairy that says, each time a counter trap card is activated, immediately after it resolves, gain 1,000 life points. And if you do, if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, destroy one card your opponent controls. Now, the Sanctuary in the Sky being on the field is a bit tough to go and actually do, because it's basically a strict -1. But I mean, this card has such a good effect there that you might want to do it anyways, because if you get a pop every time you activate a counter trap, that counter trap's dealing with an opponent's card, and also this card is dealing with an opponent's card on top of that. So I think this card is really, really good for the strategy. Yes, the Sanctuary in the Sky condition is a bit annoying, but I think ultimately it is worth doing. Also, the life point gain, don't discount that. A lot of counter traps at this time in the game's history do cost life points to use, and this can sort of recover a bit of that life points that you're losing there. So I like this card a lot. Next up, we got Nova Summoner, another very good card, not just in counter fairies, but in fairies in general. This is basically like Shining Angel, where it's 40 attack, 800 defense. That when this card is from the battle and sent to the graveyard, you can spell summon one light fairy monster, 1500 or less attack from your deck. And then if the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field, you spell summon one Air Knight Parshath instead. So, this gives you more incentive to, play Sanctuary in the Sky to bring up Parshath. I don't really think that is the best part of the effect. The best part of the effect, though, is just bring back more fairies from your deck. So you can sort of bring out like other Shining Angels potentially. It can even bring out things like Radiant Gerald, which, I mean, I don't know why you would bring out Radiant Gerald, but you could. I mean, I guess there's a defender, and Nova Summoner can summon defense, so that's a potential application. This is a fairy, 1,000 attack, 2,000 defense. When this card is sent to the graveyard, except if it's destroyed by battle, gain 1,000 life points if Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field. So again, another card, trying to pair with Sanctuary in the Sky. But the main reason you bring this out off Nova Summoner is just as a defender, so that could potentially come up. I don't really think it's the best thing in the world, but it is something that you can do if you want to. Also, if you use this for something like Horn of Heaven, then you can potentially send it to the graveyard that way, and then gain 1,000 life points on top of that. So that's kind of neat. But the new sort of pseudo-boss monster of the strategy is Neo Parshath, the Sky Paladin. It says you can special summon this card from your hand by triggering one Air Knight Parshath. If this card attacks a monster, inflict piercing battle damage. If this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent, draw one card. And then while the Sanctuary in the Sky is on the field and your life points are higher than your opponent's, this card gains attack and defense equal to the difference in life points. So a lot going on there. It combines a bunch of different effects together, basically. Air Knight Parshath is the big effect here, but it also pairs the effect with one of the agents. I believe it is Mars that does, give you a boost in attack based on your difference between your and your opponent's life points. So this effect is what Air Neo should have had, but it's on the Neo Parshath, the Sky Paladin instead. So this is another reason to potentially play Air Knight Parshath in your deck with Nova Summoner and Sanctuary in the Sky to bring it out. And this card is actually not that bad at all. And it can actually get some major damage in if you're actually able to pull it off with Sanctuary in the Sky on the field. So very, very cool thing there. As a note, some other good fairy cards that came out in the set. Gel and Duo. This is a level 4 fairy, 1700 attacks or defense. This cannot be destroyed by battle if you take any battle damage, or if you take any damage, period. So burn damage effects as well. Destroy this face-up card. This card can be treated as 2 tributes for the tribute summon of a light fairy monster, which Neo Parshath, the Sky Paladin, is. So even if you don't have that Air Knight Parshath there, you potentially set Gel and Duo and then tribute over it for Neo Parshath, the Sky Paladin, which is kind of neat. Lastly, for the fairies, we got Freya, Spirit of Victory, level 1 fairy. It says, while you control a fairy type monster other than Freya, the Spirit of Victory, your opponent's monsters cannot target this card for attack. This says all fairy type monsters you control gain 400 attack and defense. It's fine. It's like not really the best thing in the world. You can potentially, buff up a Gel and Duo to craft with a Cider, which is kind of neat, but overall this card is not really worth playing in my opinion, especially given the game plan that Counter Fairies generally uses. But in addition to type support with fairies here, this set also released some attribute support, and attribute support that actually mirrors itself in some very interesting ways. In the past, attribute support has mirrored itself this way, like in Magic Ruler when all the field spells came out, but just, shifting which attribute got the boost. And a sort of similar thing happens here. So firstly, we got Radiant Spirit for light. The level 7 reptile, 2000 attack, 1500 defense. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, destroy all face down and non-light monsters. And then you go through into Umbral Soul, does the same thing for dark monsters, has the same stats exactly. Destruction Cyclone, the same thing for wind monsters, same stats again. Raging Earth, earth monsters. Firestorm Prominence, fire monsters, and Silent Abyss, water monsters. So kind of neat that they all do this. They're also all reptiles for some reason. So neat new reptile support for different attributes. I don't really think this card is that good, because if your opponent's destroying it by battle, unless you tribute set it, they know it's coming, so they can just play around that aspect of it. And I feel like if you're bringing out a 2 tribute monster, you're generally doing other things with it. But I mean, this is a series of monsters that you can play if you want to, and they've got cool flavor. So I figured I'd mention them here. Moving on to the last cards in Strike of Neos. These are cards that I don't really think are that good and that I couldn't really fit in like naturally into the other parts of this discussion. We first got Sage of Silence and Sage of Stillness. These are two monsters with 1400 attack, 1000 defense. Sage of Silence, so if this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, your opponent can activate spells during their next turn. And Sage of Stillness does the same thing, but for traps. So I think that Sage of Silence is generally the better card because spells are something that your opponent's more likely to be activating on their turn than traps are. And yeah, I mean that's basically my reasoning for it. I don't think this card is good in general because 1400 attack is not the biggest attack stat, so not really going to be beating over too much. But there are certain decks where I could see it coming up. It's just I don't really think this card is worth playing to counter those decks. Next up, we get Card Trader, which is not a bad card, honestly. Like, this card is, like, fine. It's, like, aggressively fine. It's a card that a lot of people, including myself as a kid, really enjoyed because, like, it's like, oh, it seems so busted. You get to take your worst card, put it back in deck, and then get a new one. That's so good. But realistically, it's just a -1. There are certain decks that do actually want to actively shuffle back their pieces back in the deck in case they need to bring them out through certain effects. But I think in general, this card is not really that good. It's a continuous spell. It says 1 per turn during standby phase. You can shuffle 1 card from your hand to the deck, draw 1 card. So kind of an underwhelming effect. Again, there are certain decks that do want to use this. Like Gadgets is one that you potentially use it in. Send back a gadget to then search that out with another gadget later. But I think overall, this card is not really that good. Next up, we got Agents of Gaia, a continuous trap that says gain 3,000 life points. If this face-up card leaves the field, the controller of this card takes 3,000 damage. So it's sort of just a short-term boost of your life points, but it's also pretty easy for your opponent to get rid of. So I don't think this card is that good. Next up, we got Flashbang, a normal trap that says activate only after damage calculation when a monster your opponent controls makes a direct attack. It is now the end phase of this turn. That's kind of neat. It's a way to stop the battle phase and stop the rest of the turn entirely, honestly. But in general, if you want a better battle phase stopper, you want Threatening Roar. And I mean, generally, like at this stage in the game's history, main phase 2 does not matter as much as like battle phase and what comes before battle phase. So main phase 1, etc. Because I mean, while people do still do things in main 2, damage matters a lot. There's not as much like resilient monsters that like you can just stick and then have be an issue for your opponent there. So I will say Flashbang, I don't really think is that good in this format. Maybe in other formats, but like I don't really think it's good right here. And that's going to do it for all the new cards added from Strike of Neos. And with that, that's going to do it for all the new cards added to Demise Format. So now that we've gone through the cards, let's actually show off some decks and see what you can actually build in this format. Firstly, we got the titular deck of the format itself, Demise OTK. So this is what I was mentioning when I talked about Advanced Ritual Art here, where you can use it to bring out Demise, King of Armageddon. This is a pretty powerful ritual monster that released actually a couple sets earlier. Normally, it was summoned with End of the World, and you could pay 2,000 life points to destroy other cards on the field. But with only 2,400 attack, that wasn't really good enough, because then your opponent could generally recover on the following turns, and 2,000 life points is a pretty high cost. So what changed? Well, what changed is Advanced Ritual Art. Because people realized that if you use Advanced Ritual Art to bring out a Demise by sending insects to your grave, either 2 level 4s like Insect Knight, or 1 level 8 like Metal Armored Bug, you could actually set up for some Doom Dozer plays. And if you blow up the board with Demise King of Armageddon and are able to get a double Doom Dozer here, you actually do have exactly 8,000 damage on board. So people realized this, and Demise OTK was born. Now, will this deck be as powerful in the modern day as it was in the event that this format's based around, SJC Anaheim? That's debatable. There are, a variety of ways to play around this deck now. Like Trap Dushy really hurts this deck quite a bit, and that is a card that's played a lot more nowadays. But I do think that overall this deck is still, pretty strong and pretty neat, and it'll definitely be something that I will be experimenting with. If you want a good list for it, this is the winning list by Michael Song-Loke. And I mean, this list looks pretty classic, looks pretty good. So I think it's a good starting point for the deck if you want to dive into it. Now, if you're someone who really missed the titular deck of Airblade format and is really upset the Stratos is limited to 1, you can still play DDT. It's still a very strong deck. You still do have like 1 Stratos available, along with triple Mally, triple D-Draw, your Monster Gates, your Reasonings, etc. So you can just play this deck if you want to. I mean, it's still pretty good. And this is exactly what the second place participant of SJC Anaheim did, Chris Bowling. So, it's clearly good enough to get second place at that event. Will it be as good nowadays, or will it be even better upon modern, tinkering? Who's to say? But it's still a very, very cool list. Yes, Dimfuse is hit to 1. Yes, Stratos is hit to 1 as well. But it might still be good enough here to take some names in this format. And the last deck that I'm going to feature here, just to show the variety of decks here. If you want to play a hero deck that is not quite Airblade, not as crazy as that, you also have T-Hero. And this is the T-Hero list from this event by Thirasak, Punsambat. And I mean, this is a really, really good list. I mean, T-Hero comes from Thirasak's name here. That's one of the ways you can get that name. There's also Trooper Hero. That's another way you derive the name, because the deck does play triple Card Trooper to mill out cards into your graveyard. Card Trooper is legal in this format because it came out in the Duels Pack Jaden alongside the Duels Pack Astro Phoenix. And I mean, this is a really, really cool list. I mean, you've got a lot of ways to get heroes engraved, like your Mallies, like Fearmonger, like Disc Commander, etc. And you can do some cool stuff with it, playing double meta as well to meta out the Mallies for things like, Ryu Senshi and stuff like that. So this list is just super, super sick, and I'll definitely be experimenting with it myself as I cover the format. But I hope that you enjoyed this sort of, brief guide to the new cards added into Demise Format, and also just talking about what Demise Format is. I mean, no one really played this format because, it hadn't really existed until this point. I mean, yes, there was the original event, but no one really went back to that event specifically and explored it. So I'm excited to explore it with y'all. I'm looking forward to covering it on the channel. I'll be having videos out for it soon. So if you want to play games in this format, head over to the YGO from Zero Discord server, linked in the description down below. Also, if you want to watch my coverage of this format and know when the videos are coming out, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like down below as well to grow the community and grow the channel in the eyes of the algorithm. Also, let me know what you think about this format, what you think the top decks of the format will be. Do you think Demise OTK will still reign supreme, or do you think something like T-Hero or Airblade could potentially rise up to counter it? I look forward to discussing with y'all as always. Also, as always, big shout outs to my patrons, Rinswin, Porkchopkin, Bren Donker, Tyler Compton, GeoMyFest, Dumptruck, and Scout Zero. It means a lot that you all support in this way and could make more videos like this in the future. I hope you enjoyed this video as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.